it's always fun and wonderful until you have users. And then once you start having users and you're selling, it's like, wait a minute, this is a lot of work.
I'm excited to continue our conversation, Harjinder. In our first segment, we talked about your platform, an AI assistant for physicians, and how it's changing the game for those who are having to, well, they want to speed up the charting process. And this 5-6 years in, I'd love to hear more about your story, the journey that you've been on these past 5-6 years. How did you get to where you are today? I'd love to know, and you can even start before the 5-6 years ago.
Yeah, sure. So I've been around in the healthcare space, in particular around speech recognition and natural language processing for about 20 years. I started my career as a professor of computer science, co-founded a company with a friend that applied speech rec to the medical dictation space. Back then, physicians used to dictate their clinical notes, and we started applying speech rec to that. We sold that company to Nuance, which is the maker of Dragons, the leading product for physician dictations. And did that for a number of years, and went on to co-found another company that's doing patient engagement, automating just interaction with patients, both pre and post episodes of care. And then came back to what I really love around speech and AI in Saykara. And so, the journey for Saykara, as I said a little earlier, was really centered around physicians used to just dictate their narratives, and now the game has changed. It's all about putting data into the medical record. And so there's this overwhelmingly difficult problem of understanding conversations across any industry. This is a really difficult challenge. In healthcare, the advantage you have is that physicians are they're very repetitious. They repeat the same kind of thing. If a patient comes in for shoulder pain, they're going to ask the same kinds of questions. They're going to do the same kind of physical exams. They're going to, by and large, come up with the same broad category of assessments and plans. And so once you can start recognizing those patterns of repetitions in the process of the conversation that physicians are having, you have a real shot at understanding what these conversations are about and applying technology to it.
Now, in our previous conversation, you mentioned, I asked if you knew something 5-6 years ago, what would you know then? You mentioned just the fact that the healthcare system is so complex. Is that what you said? Or yeah. Let's dive into that.
So there's the healthcare landscape is complex on a couple of different levels. One is just the IT landscape. You have these electronic health record systems that you have to figure out how to interact with. You have the fact that across many different specialties of medicine, physician behavior is markedly different. It's different kinds of problems. Physicians, what they document can be very different. So if you're doing let's say you have shoulder pain and you go see a primary care physician, what that physician documents and cares about is different than if you go to see an orthopedic surgeon for that same shoulder pain. And so these kinds of complexities, when you're building an AI solution, ideally what you want is one kind of thing that you can focus on initially. And what we found is, as we were building our solution, there's just so many different variables, so many different kinds of, and then of course, physician behavior is very different. Some physicians like to use the product in one way, others have completely different kinds of behaviors. And so you have to start adapting to all of this at the same time when you're kind of bootstrapping the company.
These two previous ventures, it was MedRemote and Twistle, right? You both co-founded those. Yeah. You were a co-founder and CTO, now going into founding another company and being CEO. Any change in your perspective and thoughts of being CEO versus CTO, and even insights you could share to others who are CTOs now becoming CEOs?
Yeah, being a CEO is hard. I will say, thinking about the overall business. So I had the luxury when I was a CTO of having a great friend who was just fabulous as a CEO for both MedRemote and Twistle, and I didn't have to worry about a lot of the business side of things. And of course, when you're a CEO, you can't let anything drop, and you have to think about it all. The biggest thing I think we did about a year ago and this came really to a bear when we started commercializing. Up until then, you're building the product and everything's great. And for any product company, it's always fun and wonderful until you have users. And then once you start having users and you're selling, it's like, wait a minute, this is a lot of work. And so about a year ago, we hired a president COO to kind of take on the commercialization side of the company. It was the best decision I made as a CEO, is to just take that half of what I was spending a lot of my time on. And particularly for us, why it was really important was that we haven't at any point had a product where we could say, hey, the product is done, let's just sell it now, and go out and just keep marketing it and selling it. It's never been at that stage. We are trying to rapidly evolve and build a product. And, I liken it a lot to, changing the tires on a car while you're driving, right? We're evolving this, we're adding bigger, we're upgrading the engine, we're, changing out everything in that car while it's on the road now. And so you really need somebody that's actually focused on the road and somebody else that's kind of building out the core parts of it at the same time.
Funding wise, you guys were able to get some VC funding early on.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say is the biggest mistake one could make when seeking funding and acquiring that?
I think timing is essential. Once you have VC funding, there's a certain clock that starts running, right? And you have to make sure that the product is at a point where you're really ready to start scaling it or to start getting to that next stage in terms of, once the funding runs out, are you going to hit the milestones for that next step in there? So I think that's something that you have to be cognizant of. And if you can go further before you get into that point where you need VC funding, that's always, I think, the best point, is take it as far as you can before you actually need that funding. So the biggest thing is that when you're doing a pitch, and this counts for whether you're selling to your story to a VC or whether you're selling it to a customer that's looking to adopt your solution, is that you really have to have both a big vision and a small vision in mind. So when we talk to health systems or VCs, they want to see that big picture. What's that big vision that you're trying to sell? And in our case, it's that big vision is we're going to have an AI system that can sit next to that physician and not only document care, but it's also going to be able to participate in the process of care. It's going to save you money. It's going to improve your patient, the quality of your care, and so forth. Now, that's the big vision. The question is, how do you get there? And what do you do while you're trying to get there, right? Because as a startup, you can easily starve long before you ever get to that big vision. So you have to have that small vision as well. And the small vision is, what are we going to do today? What are we going to do in the product? Forget about the big vision, because your user today doesn't care about that big vision. What they care about is, I have this problem today, and how am I going to solve that problem? And so you have to really be able to cohesively tie together both that big vision and this small vision and say, hey, if I execute on this small vision and just take baby steps along the way, I'm getting to this big vision. It's not a big leap. It's not a huge chasm that I have to cross in order to go from here to there. Or if you buy that big vision is important, there is a story right now. There's something that I can do that's productive and useful today to get there. And I think all successful companies have had that combination, whether they articulate it that clearly or not. They have that as part of their pitch.
I really appreciate you moving us to the customer, because funding is one thing, but the customers are really what funds the eventual growth and profitability. Any lessons learned that you can share on getting those first initial customers on board that you can then able to grow with and really prove out the concept of the product and scale?
Yeah, no, and that I think may well be the hardest part in a startup. You have your first customer, especially your first significant customer, is really critical, and you have to convince them that you're for real, right? And when you have no customers before that, that's really difficult. So it's I don't know what the if there's any panacea, any kind of magic formula to this. In our case, because I had a long track record in healthcare that I could point to, we were able to get conversations with a lot of different health systems and medical groups, and some of them were willing to try things, and we were upfront. Hey, we just need users that are going to try this. It's going to be a little flaky the very first time you try it, and there's a lot of bugs and other things, but are you willing to try it? And in our case, because the problem we were solving for physicians was so big, I mean, physicians literally were, spending hours up to 11 o'clock at night just documenting their clinical encounters. that they were willing to try it. And so we spent a lot of time with some early users. The first 10 users we had before we actually started commercializing, we gave the product to them for free and just said, just use it. If you find it useful, keep using it. And by and large, we were able to get past the point where the platform was not stable initially, and we got it, kind of worked our way through a lot of those issues and made it work.
Any stats or metrics you can share of where you guys are today with the usage of the platform and customers?
So we have over 30 different health systems or medical groups using the product today. So it's actually getting very rapid adoption. Interestingly, the scale, the uptake has increased since COVID started, which was surprising. For the first 2 months since COVID in March and April, we had this dramatic slowdown because all of a sudden patients weren't going to see their doctors and doctors were sitting at home wondering what they're going to do with their time. But obviously that didn't last. Starting around June or so, we started just seeing all the physicians coming back for the most part and starting to see patients again. And then just a lot of pent up demand and physicians, just saying, hey, there's got to be something better. I need to find a solution. And so I think there's a general recognition across the industry that solutions exist to solve the problem of physician burnout. And so it's been really busy for us in the last few months.
As your base of customers grow, you need the right team to be able to support that growth. Any lessons learned or even common mistakes that you've seen people have made when it comes to hiring and building a team that you can advise around?
Yeah, and I think as with everything for the team, timing is everything. Hiring the wrong person or too high level a person too early can be difficult, or too late can be a challenge as well. So again, I think for us, finding somebody to head up commercialization at the point where we were starting to commercialize, in retrospect, I should have done it a year earlier before we started commercializing. So that is really important, finding salespeople that come in at the right time. And the challenge for sales is that, when you're first starting to sell, you're not going to be able to grow at the pace to motivate a really, really top-notch salesperson. And so you have to be at the point where, they can earn, the level of commission and everything that they're accustomed to at the right time. And the same thing is true on the machine learning side. Timing is really important. When we started building our infrastructure, and you're starting to look for machine learning people, well, most machine learning people just want data. They want data and they want to be able to apply algorithms to that data. And when you're building your overall architecture and infrastructure, there's really not a lot of data to give them. You're still building it, and the data hasn't started flowing until users start using your system. And so you have to find the right time to start plugging the right kind of skills into the company.
So what's that indicator for that hiring phase? Is it just before you need it, just right after, wait a little bit longer? Where's the
magic is for us, because you also have to pair that with your funding, right? So if funding was never a consideration, of course you hire everybody right up front and you have them sitting around until you need them, but that's never an option. So I would say hire them when not hiring them would actually crash the company. And so if you wait any longer, of course, you're dead. And if you do it too soon, too much sooner than that, then you're probably wasting money.
I like that. How big is the team today?
We have 27 people.
Gotcha. And moving forward from here, going into 2021, what hurdles and challenges do you see you're going to need to overcome in order to keep growing?
So there's a lot of things. Again, healthcare being what it is, it's a constantly shifting landscape. COVID has introduced some new variables for us. A lot of the care has moved online. And so we've had to adapt to that already. As you look forward, of course, the pandemic, fingers crossed, is not going to last forever. And so there's an open question of what is that mix of online versus in-person care. It's not going to go back to where it was. I mean, now that online care is here, it's here to stay. But the question is, what's the mix, and how do health systems and medical groups adapt to that over time? Because a lot of this just caught people off guard, and they just slapped together whatever solutions they could. And over the long term, you'll see platforms emerging that do a much better job with online care. And so we have to adapt and start working with those platforms better. And then the other side of this for us is that the compensation structure for physicians is a shifting landscape as well. And the way physicians get compensated changes what needs to get documented and how they document care. And so we have to be able to adapt to those changes as well.
For you personally, as a leader, do you have any favorite books, audiobooks, podcasts that you would recommend that you found great insight and learnings from?
I wish I had time to listen to podcasts and read books. In all honesty, I spend pretty much all my waking hours just thinking about how to get that next stage of the company. And I think, there's a lot. I used to do a lot of reading before, but since I started Saykara, and there comes a point in each company where you start being able to sit back and just think, and we haven't reached that in Saykara. So I would say, you're in the trenches, fighting one battle after another. And, I've read a lot of materials and blogs that give you these words of wisdom and stuff. And, I try to absorb those lessons, whether it's from the likes of Bill Gates or others like that, luminaries that have successfully built things, and that share leadership principles. But ultimately, I think it really just comes down to being in the trenches and fighting that battle on a day-to-day basis, getting your customer to be happy, and that's all that matters at the end of the day. Is if you have happy customers, you're going to succeed. If you don't, it doesn't matter what you're building.
Last question for you. What kind of technology innovations do you predict we'll see in the near term, the next year or so, and long term, 5-10 years from now?
So I think the biggest thing that's changing, and this is really what excites me, is this is absolutely the right time to be in doing conversational natural language processing kinds of work. So there's a lot of really exciting work being done. The likes of Google and Facebook and all the big tech companies are spearheading a lot of these, I would say, seismic changes in the way natural language processing is done. And even within the last 2 years, if you were to look at the way it was done even past 2 years ago to what we're able to do today with some of these pre-built models that already understand out of the gate, before we even use them, they understand English and how to understand some of the basics of the language or other languages as well. And that's really exciting. And it allows a company like ours to just take a lot of that core innovation that's being done and start leveraging that and building on top of it and adding our own novel techniques and innovation on top of that. So what I see happening in the next year is that NLP is really about to undergo, in terms of commercially, the kinds of seismic shift that deep learning introduced, say, a decade ago or so. That's happening now. You'll see that in the next year or two. And so over the next 5 years or so, what I think is going to happen is that since the dawn of computing, we've been dealing with computers not on our own terms, but in terms of the interfaces that the computers define, right? So every piece of software you ever installed, you had to sit down at some point and learn what its interface was and how to interact with it. And what you'll see as a shift as NLP gets better and better is that computers and software will do a better and better job of just understanding us on our terms in the way that we talk to people, the way we're having this conversation right now. And it'll mean that there's less and less reliance on a particular interface and more just natural dialogue. Now that, of course, is the big kind of vision that movies and books have been painting for the last century. But I think it's actually getting close now, and we'll start seeing a lot of that over the next 5 years.
Have you seen a company using AI, machine learning, or other technology to transform the way we live, work, and do business? Go to uptechreport.com and let us know.